and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and re-enchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and re-enchanting. Hello and welcome to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott and I am your hostess, and I am so delighted to be joined today by Max Dashu in the studio. Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I met Max, I guess it was almost a year ago, probably now, when we were both part of the Land Justice Futures conversation on rematriation and looking at withdrawing consent. And we were both talking about co-teaching a course on a particular lesson within a wider context on the histories of the witch hunts. And in that process, I learned how incredible Max's work is. And since then, I have had so many people tell me, "Oh, Max, Max's work is amazing." And I'm like, "Yes, yes, it is." So it's like, good 50 years of independent scholarship looking into the histories, suppressed archives, histories of women's history. And that's including both the histories of patriarchy and violence against women, the suppression of women, and the suppression of women frequently, almost always, also comes the suppression of the earth and ecologies, and also the histories of matriarchy and the histories of women's leadership, both within and outside of those contexts. So while we started our conversations with a shared interest in the witch hunts and patriarchy and how that impacts us today, which is super important, I really want to highlight today the work of what does it mean to go back for women and many people today across the gender spectrum to engage with matriarchal histories, to find matriarchal histories within your own lineages, and to think through and re-engage with a non-colonial history for yourself and your children. And all of those in your community. So, Max, where should we start when we're thinking about this question?
Well, for me, my starting point, first we have to realize that we're trying to swim through a sea of garbage to get at the gems, because there's such a distorted presentation of the human cultural record that we are educated in. Or even if we're not educated, we get it through movies, mass media, novels, all of these things that package information, or it's not really even information. It's stories, maybe sometimes, mythologies even, about who humans have been, what our history looks like. We have this very, very patriarchal and colonial narrative that's shoved at us. And so decolonization is like really at the root of a lot of this. The narratives about women are so disempowering. And I think a lot of times that many women are not even conscious of how that is. But I know growing up that, you watch the movies and the woman had to lose. She always gave in. Katharine Hepburn is tamed one way or another, and there are these ways that we are conditioned to be demoralized about our own power, about our own heritages, because there's a very selective gatekeeping that goes on as far as what information we have access to, and I include in information images. Because, the cultural record as it's been given to us is history. So it's the written record by elite men of certain dominant societies. So we already have a built-in bias there. The narratives of dynastic scribes, the inscriptions of rulers, all of this kind of stuff, and also patriarchal religious narratives. And so women are kind of thin on the ground in that. And the main way we've seen women in those standard histories is occasionally you'll see a queen or a concubine, and then you'll have the demonization of a figure like Jezebel. There's some very well-known names of women, but Marie Antoinette, they're negative. And, the positive ones tend to be patriotic. So you have Joan of Arc, or you have Betsy Ross, or whatever. They very much fit nationalist narratives very often, or, religious ones. But for me, I started out trying to understand where on the planet are women free. And, I was just about to leave university in the fall of 1969. So it's really 56 years now for me. And I was just prospecting through the libraries and looking at everything I could, looking for matriarchal societies, which I had just learned this word. And my anthropology professor told us, well, there are matrilineal societies, but that doesn't mean anything because men have always dominated all human societies. And I'm just, matrilineal societies. And I went looking for that. And one of my early intuitions is that if there are all these very hierarchical cultures, the kingdoms, the empires, all of that, then maybe more egalitarian societies are places where we could look for female spheres of power, that women were in public leadership, that women were not just subordinated and, into a very, very narrow sphere. And so I was looking for that, and so indigenous orature was one area that I began to discover some of the most powerful stories were coming out of historical orature from North America, various different places. And then I was also looking at archaeology, and what I discovered is the further back in time you go, the more images of women you got. So when you get into the Neolithic, the central iconography is female, these ancient female figurines that you find over much of the planet. So those were some early clues. But I think, for many of us, it's like we don't know where to look. And how do we find this knowledge, right? And there's a lot of what I call scanning the cultural record. So we're not only looking at the written sources, although we don't ignore those. Those give us a lot of clues. But we have to also look at Native histories when we can access them. And that's something that's coming into view more and more, being published, and also now in video and other media. Look at archaeology, look at linguistics, iconography, very, very important, and that includes rock art. And so the full cultural record, not just Western Civ, not just dominant societies like the Chinese Empire or, whatever we're looking at, Mesopotamia, but to get really more of a global view and see what women look like in that broader view. And this is a large undertaking because we're really going up against all kinds of theoretical interpretations of, I was thinking yesterday about this because, the 19th century scholars were all about, Darwin had just come into play, and they were all about evolutionary theories of history. And so they came up with this scheme of savagery, barbarism, civilization, right? And this is really obviously very biased. It's very Eurocentric in the way that they spin all of this out. Here's the worthy people over here. They're the people like us. They're literate. They have kingdoms. They have states. And the others are, well, really of no account, according to this narrative. But I think there's another deeper level we can look at, because going to the matricultures, or even just going to the tremendous part women played in creating the life support matrix for humanity. So, before agriculture even, we have women foraging for food. They're digging roots. They're gathering fruits and nuts. Seeds. They're pounding seeds and making bread out of seeds. They get grinding stones. And so the very, very, very early Neolithic, we have these grinding stones coming into play. And they're in North Africa, they're in Australia, they're in North America, all kinds of places that don't normally get presented to us as part of the overarching historical narrative. So then we begin to see women as foragers and hunters included in that, and making cords and baskets. Women had to carry children, so twining fibers to make nets was really important early on. Women were inventors. I call it mother tech. Or they were using leather to make cradle boards,
Uh-huh.
right? They're creating, they're inventing. And so the whole foundation of the bulk of what we're surviving on, including the invention of agriculture, is down to the women coming out of their food gathering. We could even look at language in that way. You know, hunters don't really talk to each other because its silence is important. They might use signs. But women in the collective social motherhood that's characteristic of early societies need to communicate in their fostering of life, the care of the young, care of the old and disabled. You know, so the language is taught by women predominantly, and we could even hypothesize
Yeah.
originated primarily by women. So there's all these ways that, you know, the Matt Walshes of the world, it's like, we built civilization, we created everything, you're indebted to us, without us you are nothing, is a complete fabrication. And there have been a lot of women who've fallen for this narrative, you know, and so the feminist view is we have to reconstruct and reinterpret everything. And we have to look in a really much broader way. And that takes us also to the cultural record in representations of women. You can see very clearly a contrast in the way that women are represented in Paleolithic and Neolithic art than they are shown, say, in Hellenistic art. You see a sexualization going on that's very much oriented to the male gaze. The ancient figurines are often naked. They may emphasize the cupping of the breasts, for example, is a gesture that you see cross-continentally in the ancient figurines, and even sometimes like in wooden sculptures, right, in Africa and in Australasia. But it's a different context. It's not like coy, sexy, shrinking violet kind of, you know, like the Venuses, but instead it's like, I give life. I am potent. You know, they're not posing. They're looking at full on with powerful eyes, broad stance. The body is not slight. It's substantial. It's muscular. And so the other thing about this is that in all likelihood, especially with the ceramic figurines, these are probably female self-representations, whereas that other art is made by men for the male gaze. And one of the aspects of patriarchy is women learn to adapt themselves and model their body movement and their very presence, their inhabiting of their bodies by the Marilyn Monroe pose, right? You know, standing on one leg and putting the knees together, and you know, these poses we're familiar with from fashion magazines, movies, and everything. It looks very different when you see statues out of ancient Colombia, out of Congo, even the Neolithic Egyptians, and, you know, just would go on naming places. But this is exactly what we've been deprived of. The gatekeeping has kept out because they weren't, you know, it's not necessarily a conspiracy. They just didn't think it was important, or they felt threatened by it, or whatever the reason was. When the big coffee table books about human civilization were being, you know, there's a big trend toward those in the 60s and onward, the people that were choosing the color picture plates that were going to be emphasized, they were generals and kings and male philosophers and scientists and the great men. And then sometimes when I would be looking through these books, I would see little black and white photos of the ancient female figurines. That's how I first came across them. And that was not a very satisfying source because they weren't even very often identified by place or date or anything, to say nothing of fine context that could tell us something about how they were, their significance, were they found in ritual context, for example. A lot of them are from burials, it turns out. So the ancestral mother connection is very much there. But then I went over into looking at archaeological site excavation reports. And there you begin to get more of what's there. They're still really obsessed with flint tips, weapon heads and things like that. But at least there you could find the images. And so I began collecting them. And, this is a long undertaking. I think by now, at this point, there's a lot more women who are daylighting this imagery and saying, look, this exists. Look, before the Lord our God, there's Asherah. There's actually a partnership in the cosmology, because the inscriptions of the 10th century in ancient Israel are still talking about Yah of Shomron, of Samaria, and his Asherah, Asherato, and there's all these linguistic arguments about that. But the Asherah imagery and written references are there, so showing that ancient Hebrews, far from being
what was the Asherah?
What?
What was the Asherah imagery in ancient Israel? Who was that?
In the case of Asherah, the imagery is a little harder to come by. There's a lot more of a different goddess, sort of the maiden goddess, Ashtart, who represents the planet Venus. So she's the correlate to Ishtar. She's the linguistic exact cousin of Ishtar, and also of Inanna, which is a different language family. But they're all the planet Venus. But Asherah, among all the Semitic peoples, they had a great mother goddess, Asherah. And this is mainly from inscriptions. Not as many images because they were all smashed, or burned. So in the Bible, there are references, and Raphael Patai, the Hebrew goddess, is a great source on this. He documents that for 2/3 of the existence of the temple at Jerusalem, an Asherah stood in the temple. So it's a wooden pillar. We don't know if it was carved or anything about it, but these pillars were attacked repeatedly by the Hebrew prophets, and some of the kings put them up in the temple. Sometimes the queens, like Queen Makkah, raised an Asherah, and then later on another king comes along and knocks it down. But Asherah is the Hebrew form. We see Ashertum in Babylonian and Akkadian, so they had this form also, and she's called Atirat or Ashirat in Ugaritic, which is over on the coast of Syria. So all of those societies had this form, and the Ugaritic scripture is really interesting because they call her Kaniatu Elima, which means the progenitrix of the gods. This is a term that turns up all over the world. So in Aztec, we have Teteo Inan, mother of the gods. And there's a whole, I have a whole slideshow that talks about these different eponyms for goddesses. Kibele in Anatolia, which is now Turkey. They call her the mother of the gods. We usually get it in Greek or Latin, but that's the translation for it. And so there are even these sort of generations of goddesses. You have the older mother goddesses, and you have the maiden figures like Ashtart, which the Greeks Astarte is their way of pronouncing that. So tracking the goddesses became one pathway that I went down because that was where a lot of the female imagery was.
I'm so intrigued with both that, looking into the archaeological records and finding these ancient mother goddesses, and then kind of seeing the similarity linguistically, as well as in the actual images themselves, as how they were portrayed as a way of seeking a pattern that has been suppressed but is still with us in these various ways. Can you? I know you did some similar work in West Africa and Asia, Southeast Asia, and I know that some of our audience might be interested in both those places. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, in Africa, some of the oldest archaeological finds, of course, come out of the Nile Valley. And so you have a whole tracking where you can see a continuity in the Neolithic, even pre-hieroglyphic cultural record. You have these female figurines that have their arms raised above their head in a gesture of invocation. It seems to track also with a gesture that's even today found in East African dance, where the women dance the sacred cow and hold their arms up like the cow horns. So you see this in Uganda and
Oh,
in Rwanda. But so there are these very long through lines that sometimes we can turn up. But what's interesting about Egypt is that we have several different media where you have the figurines with the vulture-headed women with their arms curved up over their heads in this same dance gesture that I was just describing for East Africa. We have painted ceramics showing women making that gesture, but this time they're riding in a ceremonial boat along the Nile. And you can see animals and the whole land in the background. There's the water pattern, there's ostriches, there's ibexes, different animals. And then there are also paintings, a few surviving murals. There's one painting on linen. And so you have this imagery, and this is where we really get into the problems with interpretation. Because is it goddess? Or is it ancestral woman? Or is it an invoking priestess, which it really appears to be in many
huh.
cases? So these theoretical boundary lines that moderns try to draw, we can't necessarily say for certain. But what happens is that when we go into the dynastic period in Egypt, many of these same attributes recur with the statues of Isis and Neit. Well, this is another example of the great mother of the gods. In Egyptian tradition, we have a lot of writing about her along those lines, and also as the great creatrix. There's some litanies of Neit that describe her in very eloquent ways about that. And I could pull some of those up. It would take a minute though. But, so that's one example. But see, the other thing is, and there's a lot of differences about what the cultural record looks like. Because say, for example, Central Africa, it's rainforest. People carved wood at a very early period, but it doesn't last very well under those climatic conditions. So it's much more difficult for Congo to turn up something of that time depth. But where we can do it, and this is a much disregarded area, is the Sahara. And in fact, the Sahara has an older iconographic record than Egypt because the Sahara was once much better watered. There were actually rivers in the Sahara, and we can see the remnants of that in the weathering of the rock. So in Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, that's the core of it, but going over into Morocco and Western Sahara, there is this amazing rock art mural galleries. It's a record of the women, the men, everything. You've got hunters, but I concentrate, of course, on the women. There's some very powerful imagery. One of the most famous is known as the Lady of Aouandret, and she's in southern Algeria in the Tassili Najar region, where a lot of these rock galleries are. Whole murals, traditions. And she's a woman who is running, and she has on ceremonial regalia. So she's wearing a fringed kilt, and she has fringed ties on both her arms and her legs. And she has what look like puppets, little knitted or twined coverings. Her hands don't show. She has her hands inside of these almost sleeves that have streamers from them. They look like something that the Inuit women use. They have these hand puppets that they use, or these hand streamers, in their dance. And she's running. And around her in the background are older paintings, or maybe some later ones also superimposed over her. But around her head is it looks like she's horned. And there's this field of numinous dots there. And there's kind of a rectangular shape. So some archaeologists have said, well, it looks like that's a cloud and there's rain. And this is reasonable interpretation because between her legs is a much smaller female figure who has a rainbow over her. And here again, we see these through lines because in Zulu tradition, at the opposite end of Africa, their great goddess is called Nomhu Bulwane, and she is a rainbow being. She's a rain bringer. And so these rain goddess aspects are very strong in the African tradition.
Mm.
We could go on, but it's
Mm.
kind of difficult. I would like to be able to show you the images because that's what speaks so much. That's really what the medicine is for women because you don't necessarily have to be a historian or an archaeologist or a scholar to look at these and to feel them, to be moved by them, to really perceive something about who women have been, in different cultural contexts that we have never been shown. Right. And so
I
that's
see.
why I teach with images, because that too, that's the bulk of the cultural record, actually, is the figurines and the rock paintings and the statues, all of those things, the murals, and including also the codexes and the papyruses and all of those things. But, the temple statues and things. But we need a broader view because otherwise we're going to still get stuck in the hierarchical preoccupations of patriarchal and imperial societies. So that's ever since
Mm.
the 70s, feminists have been looking for this information, and you have early books that came out like Merlin Stone, When God Was a Woman, and just countless things have been published by now. And so there are more resources now
Okay.
than when I began, where I was still looking in card catalogs. And this is something about how information is structured for us, because you would look under women and you would see motherhood, housewife, fashion, that kind of stuff. It didn't have anything about farmers or potters or house builders. That was just the bias of
Mm.
the way the information. Now we have digital
Even though
searches.
the
You can,
majority,
yeah,
even the
yeah,
majority of farmers are women.
right. And even, in modern times, women still provide the bulk of the food supply in most societies. But, this extractivist colonization has really wreaked tremendous damage on the capacity to do that. So, there's different ways of approaching this, and people will be different, interested in different things. But one of the things I think it's really
Okay.
critical to know about is that there are matricultural societies, that there is not just one social organization. I mean, as my anthropology professor was trying to instruct us, he was saying, well, there are matrilineal societies, but it signifies nothing. This narrative of patriarchy from the very beginning, and this is who humans are. And even when we look at the sociobiologists, going all the way back to Darwin, there's a continual attempt to narrate male domination. And it's not until you get female scientists like Sarah Blaffer Hrdy coming in and actually looking, or Jane Goodell or others, looking at primates from that angle of view, she was able to bring forward the intense dependence on female labor that primates, not just primates, mammals, what the mothering work is. And one of the things that she demonstrated is that postmenopausal or post-reproductive females among primates, apes, for example, our closest relatives, that the protective and providing power of elder females is crucial to the survival of the young. And the strategies, and the bonobos show us this very clearly, that the chimps have a more male-dominant structure, but the bonobo females learned to bond together, and they created female alliances that mitigated against patriarchy, or against, male domination, I guess we should call it. But I think even with apes, there's some element cultural. It's not only just genetic mandates, but there are actually behaviors that are learned and passed on, and signals and kinds of calls that are used, all of that. So, there's a very broad net to cast to try and understand. Anyway, I got kind of off track there, but I want to go back to the mother law societies. And by that,
Mm.
it's not a strict formulaic definition, because there's a whole variant world out there. It's very diverse. We have to look at the historical aspect of this as well. But we can see there's a pattern of societies which are matrilineal, matrilocal, meaning that the residence is near the female and her kin, So that's more protective. You can't beat up your wife. A man can't beat up his wife without, if their kin are around. They're not going to allow it, until patriarchy comes along, and then the brothers are in in compliance with patriarchy. But not even just those factors, because a lot of foraging peoples are bilateral, so they count both lineages. But what they don't do is enforce paternity. They don't enforce patrilineage. They have other cultural ways of assigning, like, for example, in South America, there are a lot of societies that have what they call partible paternity. So a woman can have many polyandrous partners. And what they've devised is a cultural script that says all of these men who are lovers with this woman, when she gives birth, they are all fathers of that child. It's not about a genetic thing. It's just that they have contributed to that child, and so they all become providers for that child. So it's very adaptive, whereas patriarchy is maladaptive. It mitigates against the survival of huge groups of mothers and children, right? They can end up first dependent because males control all the resources, dependent on males, but then also become homeless, become outcasts, have no means of supporting themselves except through selling their bodies or doing the very lowest paid work in the society. That's patriarchy. So anyway, matrilineage, matrilocality, social motherhood, very, very important, because unlike modern American society where the bulk of the caregiving work falls on a single mother. I mean, not a single mother, I don't mean that, but on the mother alone. She can be single or she can be married. She's still going to do all of this work. She has the full responsibility. She's the one who gets up in the middle of the night, all of that stuff. So social motherhood means that you, instead of a nuclear family, you have more of a spread out society where the sisters and the brothers are part of the caregiving. They're part of the life support. It's shared. There's generational levels of caregiving that is shared, and this is so crucial. We don't have this. We don't even have really a child care system in the United States. So it all falls, the bulk of this burden falls on women. And so there's that. There is the
That's a huge
communitarian
task.
ethos. It's big. And then, these are communitarian societies. And you will find this in some patrilineal systems, because I regard patriarchy or patriarchalization as a series of historical processes, and it doesn't always happen the same way. Sometimes it arises within societies, sometimes it's imposed from without, or a combination of those. That's a whole other discussion. But just sticking with the communitarian ethos it's not a private property orientation. It's the shared kindred. So the house, the land, maybe the whole certain region belongs to a particular clan, that this is their gathering area, or the areas where they cultivate their food. And there's exchange within all of that. That's really important, because private property is pretty tightly connected with patriarchalization, accumulation of goods, and then eventually wealth differential, class systems. This is why with the Romans, and this is quite late in history, where you already have a lot of elements of patriarchy going on, but the patricians, meaning those of the father, are the ruling class and the landowners. And the plebeians don't really necessarily even have land. They're the laboring class. And the plebeians means the people. Okay? And so there are sayings in Latin about how, the patricians recognize the father, but the plebeians don't really know who their fathers are, because men don't control women. They can't police women in order to be positive that the offspring are theirs. And patriarchy is a huge preoccupation. So there's the communitarian ethos. Then there is non-aggression. Very important codes. And this is something you can see very clearly in a lot of the foraging societies. The Western civ bias is to say these are the least advanced societies, but they're actually in many ways the most advanced, because they are stateless, they are cooperative, and non-aggression is really important. They realize that it's maladaptive for any kind of male pattern violence, especially, to be allowed to run rampant. It results in deaths. in injuries, in wars, in conflict. And it's maladaptive. So they have very strong codes. And not only around aggression, but around selfishness. Sharing is really strong ethos. And this is a survival priority because you can't always find the animals that are being hunted. There might be periods where there's nothing. And that is when you are dependent on both the mother line and the father line. You go around your relatives somewhere else, and guess what? They have some, and they share it. And so this contributes to human survival. Then there's the spiritual realm. And we could even extend this to public leadership, because in patriarchy, men arrogate public leadership, be that political or religious, right? In various spheres, economic as well. In the matriarchal societies or egalitarian societies, women can be public leaders. Women can speak in public. Women, the strongest pattern that I began to find early on, not so much for women political leaders, although you had some queens, things like that, but was really spiritual leadership by women. The medicine women, the prophetic women, the seers and the diviners, the dreamers, all of those things. There's a very strong, even in patriarchal times, this remains a female sphere of power. And it may be still institutionalized as it was in ancient Greece. You have priestesses in the goddess temples for the most part, and priests in the gods' temples. But also in other ways where, for example, in a patriarchal society, women may be dominated by men in marriage. How brides come in, and, patrilocal marriage, they marry out, they're separated from their kin, they come in at the very bottom, they're outsiders, they have to deal with hostile mother-in-laws, all those things. No, you could say, all right, that's patriarchy, it's done. It's a process that happened, it's over and done with. But no, because women found ways, whether it be in the economic sphere or in the spiritual sphere. For example, in the Yoruba culture, women are very powerful as priestesses. In South Africa, which is predominantly patrilineal societies, and sometimes very patriarchal ones, you have the women are predominantly the Isangoma. They are the medicine women and the diviners. And so women don't just cave in to male domination. They find ways. And so in some cultures, it may be the spiritual sphere where they really carve out a space. And in others, and again, going back to West Africa, the market women, the economic sphere. And this is something that was a powerful force in West African societies. Not only in Africa itself, but in the African diaspora. You continue to see the market women in the Caribbean, in the Carolinas, in South America, and even in Veracruz in Mexico, African women who had been brought over by slave traffickers and end up in the Americas, carving out a way for themselves to survive by selling goods. And even within slavery, or making themselves free women because they're able to buy their freedom through this power that they had as a heritage out of their West African ancestry.
I'm so curious at this point about so many things. I love hearing kind of these geographies and localities reimagined in this lens and kind of like brought to life in a different way. It's really encouraging. And I'm
Well,
so
see, that's where the
curious
juicy stuff is.
how, yeah,
You
yeah.
have to go
And so,
local,
and like,
because the overarching narrative books aren't going to tell you about this stuff. You have to go into the local ethnic cultural record.
right. And that's such an important point when people are doing research, to look into folklore, to look into local songs, to look into like
Mm-hmm.
hyper local folk traditions, as well as archaeological traditions, to see what's there, to look into food cultures, and dream interpretation, and there's many
Yep.
different forms of spiritual power, and
Yeah.
letting, like, as you're looking, you have to expand your understanding
Mm-hmm.
of even what power is in order to
Yep.
see what's there.
Well, and this is something I had to learn because initially I was looking for the larger narratives. I knew I had, from the very beginning,
Uh-huh.
I was like, okay, I have to know where the empires are and the patriarchies in order to know where else to look, where are the places where I should dig deeper. But it took me a while to realize that it's not only about the ancient figurines or the matrilineal evidence of matrilineal societies, but also a lot of information about women's potency is you have to look into the history of weaving, of pottery, or even just like
Mm.
the ways. Like there's I forget which of the Pueblo societies it is where when they go to gather clay. I mean, the Western Civ view is this is like you're just going to go get clay and it's something you're going to use and you're going to make pots. It's utilitarian and technological and economic, but it's not spiritual. But in this Pueblo tradition, they
Mm.
would do ceremony to the mother of clay and they would bring offerings to her and ask her permission to dig the clay. And then they would take the clay back. So the whole process, there was an integration of the technological and the economic, the actual use of the clay for pottery with the spiritual. It was not yet sliced up. And so this is part of what we have to understand. And the same is true for weaving. Spinning and weaving are just loaded. My book, Witches and Pagan, Women in European Folk Religion, has a whole body of knowledge in there that I was able to uncover of imagery of the spinner as the fates, as goddesses, but also as ancestral women. The fairy faith is very much tied up together with female ancestors. Particularly in Celtic lore, we see that, but elsewhere in Slavic and other traditions. And so then there's just like all these different levels and manifestations where spinning and weaving come into play, and the chants that the women sang while they were spinning. Somebody told me once, I haven't been able to see this documented, that there was a law in England in I think the 1500s that women could not sing anymore while spinning because it was considered to
Oh,
be
wow.
witchcraft, too powerful. And we certainly know that there were spinning
Because it
songs
was
that
so,
were, it was powerful and it was a threat to patriarchal power, to patriarchal domination. But we have examples in Norse tradition, for example, there's this woman called Katla who is using her distaff and her spinning chant in order to cast a spell that enemies are coming to kill her son. And so she needs to hide him, but they're going to search the house. So she's sitting there with her distaff and she's spinning and she's singing this song and she casts a glamour over everything so that they see her son, but they perceive him as a pig lying on the ground. And so
mm,
they leave and she saves him. This is the power that's attributed by the ancient cultures to women's spiritual arts, including in this case the distaff, which is like a sign. In in feudal Europe, there was a polarity. The men's side was called the spear side, and the women's side was called the distaff side. And we still have that in English. The
mm,
distaff side refers to women and women's power.
and the
But that's
distaff,
been largely
and the
away.
distaff is like, it's a staff, right? It's an actual kind of a
Yes,
staff.
it literally means a flax staff in Anglo-Saxon,
Mm,
Old English, right? So you'd wrap
mm,
the unspun combed flax or the wool, whatever you have, around the top of the distaff, and then you'd pull it down. It was just a way to feed the fibers so that you're twisting with your fingers and you're also using usually a drop spindle to pull it so that it tightens and it's turning. There's a torque to it that makes the thread stronger. And so this distaff is used in South America, parts of North America. The biggest distaffs in the world are the Salish women's up in the northwest coast between Canada and what's now the U.S. And then they have them in Tibet. They have them in North Africa, West Africa. We could just go on naming places that this technology was known. And it's universally women's sphere, although you will see men spinning in certain cultures. And so there's that crossover. Does the culture have a rigid
mm,
allocation or insistence on gender roles, or is it fluid and flexible? So you will see Tibetan male herders out in the fields and they don't have a lot to do, so they're spinning the yak hair. And then that can be in turn given
mm.
back to the women to weave into clothing, or in the case of yak hair, they use it for tents. There's so many things. And so I think it's really important to say, though, that, we've been looking primarily at the matricultural patterns, at female spheres of power, which include the economic, but how that interweaves with the spiritual. And the other thing we have to learn to think about is that patriarchalization is a historical process. So there's a tendency, there has been in anthropology, to look at a culture and say, this is how it is, this is how it's been, without realizing that there's this cumulative process of overlays of patriarchy happening. So there's a very interesting, I would call her a political theorist, Julieta Paredes. She's an Aymara woman from Bolivia. And she's part of an indigenous feminist movement called Feminismo Comunitario, communitarian feminism. And so what she talks about very eloquently, mostly available in Spanish, unfortunately, but she talks about how they did have a patriarchal system in the Andes before the Spanish conquest, but the Spanish were much worse. And they imposed a far greater degree of patriarchal control than what had prevailed earlier. And so there's a complexity to our analysis, because there's been a tendency to say, that, well, there's the only patriarchy is what was brought by European colonization, which I am no defender of. But you can see indigenous patriarchies arising in different places, and sometimes by conquest in earlier periods. And so there is an element of first raiding and then warfare, taking captives, which in early history were overwhelmingly female captives. And so you have a degradation of women's status as potential captives. And, in the Iliad, even the queen of Troy can become a female captive. The princess Cassandra can become a raped slave concubine of Agamemnon. So there is this vulnerability of women when aggression comes about. And a lot of times wars start over one group of males raiding and taking female captives. And this is pretty much every continent has evidence of this. So that male aggression is a really important part of the pattern of patriarchalization. Invasion extends that. So you have the expansion of patriarchy, of slaving, actually to males as well, which we see in the Sumerian Empire already, one of the very early records. We see it in China and other places. But, of course, then the transatlantic slave trade, this takes on massive dimensions. So there are all these other levels we have to look at of invasion, enslavement, colonization, empire building, state creation as aspects of patriarchy. So this is where feminism intertwines with anti-colonial analysis. This is where patriarchy intertwines with imperialism and capitalism, and what I said before about the class systems. They go together, and there has been in the 20th century, and maybe even earlier, an attempt to pit those analyses against each other. It can't be done. Even when we're looking at early peoples where raiding goes on and women are being captured, that is something that, it's certainly patriarchy. Enslavement of women, rape of women is patriarchy, but it's women of the other, and they don't have necessarily a concept of race, and they may even be people of, similar language and ethnicity that are doing this, but it's the othering that's an element, that's the predecessor of classic imperial racism and the caste systems that grew out of it.
So, well, this kind of brings me to another question. It's like, I used to live in India, and, that was my first time living in a culture that was where the mother goddess figures and the many, many, many goddesses were so prevalent and so important to the people who lived there, and was such a major part of daily life. And almost every house would have, an altar to at least one, if not multiple, female deities. And it was also a place with a tremendous amount of abuse towards women. Is
Yes.
today very much a place with a tremendous amount of patriarchy and a tremendous amount of women being abused in all sorts of different ways, inside and outside of the home, and within the community in different ways. And of
Hmm.
course, there are some places, some places more than others. It's not the same everywhere, but like, when you're looking at these dynamics, not that it's for anyone to judge another culture fully, but how do you understand, how can we understand some of the dissonances
Right.
um,
Yeah.
within dynamics?
India is a very special case because India is an incredibly diverse society. There's a lot of different peoples inside of India, and India
Yes,
has an
yes,
imperial history. And so there's a lot of things to
yes,
look at here because the way I see it, huh?
of its
The way
own,
I see it,
completely independent.
yeah, is that there were Indo-European invasions into India. We're starting to see evidence of this in the genome. But, the Dalit people have had this analysis for a long time. People that were defined in recent history as outcasts or untouchables, but, the word Dalit means the oppressed, which is more accurate, were once indigenous peoples. They were nations, they were peoples. But they were subjugated such a long time ago, that the caste system, they have lost some degree of their indigeneity. They may not necessarily anymore speak an Aboriginal language, the Adivasi languages of India, right, which means the dwellers from the beginning. Say basically Aboriginal is what Adivasi means. So there is an entire within the caste system you have that, but you do have also surviving indigenous peoples. Now the patriarchal transformations have been going on for many thousands of years on the subcontinent. So that the way I see it is that there was this very strong orientation to the Great Mother within original Indian societies. Here come the Aryas, and you have imposition of the class system of Indo-Europeans over still a majority. And you can see elements of this in the Mahabharata and various other Vedic writings, that there are all these peoples that are different and they're scolding them. Those women are living under no restraint and they're dancing, wearing practically nothing else but jewels and flowers and vociferating indecencies. They're very disapproving, but they're telling us that they're free women, who are living
Mm,
an indigenous life within that time period. So this is what I was saying before. There's layer upon layer upon layer, and you have this intense patriarchy. The rate of rape in India is it's just uncontrolled. And it is not only a sexed oppression, but it's also largely racialized through the caste system, so that Dalit women are the most targeted group, with impunity. The upper castes do not punish the men who do these things. So there's a lot of complexity to this. But I would just say that, we have to look at thousands of years of sometimes gradual conquest. There are a lot of studies that have been done about the Aboriginal Indian peoples gradually becoming Sanskritized. And so what they do is they adapt the names of goddesses out of the Vedic naming, the Sanskrit name, to their own goddess. So there's an example in Orissa, which is Mangala, which means the auspicious one. And this is a Sanskrit name over an indigenous goddess who is worshipped in the form of a pot, which is a uterus symbol very, very strongly in various parts of India. You see it also in Assam. They fill a
yeah,
pot with
okay.
rice, they put a vulva symbol over it, and they smear it with red kumkum, and they worship that as goddess, right?
Mm.
So it's extremely complicated, but India is somewhat unique because there's not a lot of patriarchal societies surviving that still have goddess veneration integrated in them. And it's very contradictory.
Hmm.
You can do a little bit see that in China, and I found
Hmm.
this out really rather late, is you do have survival of goddess traditions in China, and particularly in Taoism, Taoist mysticism. And oh, there's a book by the first Westerner to be initiated into Taoism, and he's telling us something that I've never seen anywhere else. He's saying that the libationers, who are the Taoist clergy, no male can be initiated without a female counterpart. So there are
Wow.
ways that some of these older matricultural elements can survive, and Taoism has a lot of things like that, as well as patriarchal elements. that have crept in. So there's a lot of complexity to this. And, I think, a lot of our task is to be able to just simply taste the medicine of seeing these powerful images, or, even just in the photographic record, when I would find a priestess, this dynamic dance of a priestess in Dahomey who's leading ceremony and the integration of dance and incantation, not just the saying of words only, in kind of sterile ceremonies that, the various priesthoods of the world, but, a much more ecstatic element. This is also characteristic of spirituality where women are full participants or even leaders.
Hmm. So that kind of gets me to, I think, a really interesting challenge of like, so how do we think about the difference between looking for patterns across cultures?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think what you're talking about in terms of the different types of dancing is a really good example of this. And how the dance differs and changes and what types of dance, because that tells us what kinds of dance we might want to engage with today. And then how do we like lift up that pattern seeking and yet at the same time avoid cultural appropriation and
Right.
also avoid cherry picking, right? Like just taking a little bits here and there that we think are cool. Like without understanding the ecological context or that particular nuanced context of any given culture,
Yeah.
which we
Yeah.
frequently don't understand.
Right. Well, I think, there's a level of learning from that can be different than appropriating and actually copying, right?
Mm,
And that's an important distinction because you have to experience what you have not experienced before in your life. You haven't seen it, you haven't heard it, you haven't felt it. Feeling it is really important because you get an idea of what real ceremony looks like. You know, not the domination-based ceremony with the big priest up there and everybody else is just following rote through the same deadening patterns, right? But something that's alive. And there are things that are universal that we don't have to worry about appropriating the round dance, the circle dance, or various kinds of processions. These various gestures, even the raising of the hands in adoration or reverence. There's a lot of things that have to do with the human body itself and who we are in this body. Even just the polarities of the body, the right and left sides, and the movement of the polarities of the body. This is something that manifests in all forms of dance. And so for people of European descent we're not the only ones who have been alienated from our historical um, heritages, but that I think the process of patriarchalization and colonization is very old there. And so it's a longer reach. It's a reach across more time. Looking back into our own heritages and looking at the pattern recognition can show us, oh yeah, well, you know what? We had, for example, the Greeks had the spiral dance, that was taught from Ariadne, the priestess of the labyrinth out of Crete. And then it's brought into Delos, and from there it disseminates across the Aegean, and it was a spiral dance, uh, symbolizing and actualizing the journey into the labyrinth and out of the labyrinth, which was not just the temple in Crete, but really signifies entering into the great mystery, in the processes of transformation, of birth and
mm,
death and rebirth, right? So that's
mhm.
one example. I think when you raise pattern recognition, it's extremely important. I talk about this a lot because we begin to recognize the commonalities. There's a lot of differences in the way all these different peoples do things, and across history even more so. But there are these recurring patterns, whether they are in representation, like I talked before about the life giver iconography of the woman cupping her breasts. And there are many others that we see happening on all continents, in various forms. Here it may be rock art, there it may be weaving, but the symbolism, is having to do with revering the ancestral mother or grandmother, or it's having to do with the tree of life. These are things that recur over and over again. And this is something that is our common human heritage. It's a birthright. That's different than saying, you know, here's an example. People who say, well, I was really moved. I feel a lot of white women will say, I feel so drawn to blah, blah, blah. And so they recognize the sacredness of the sweat lodge, right? And they may have been invited in by Lakota people or anybody else to a sweat lodge and being given that experience. But that doesn't mean they have the right to take that out and now they're going to go hold workshops and make people pay to, they don't have that authorization. Even if they were invited in
Mhm.
once, it doesn't mean that they were invited in by everybody, right? But here's the but. There are sweat house traditions in Europe. I have a whole slideshow on this
Mm.
on video on YouTube that's called Sweat Houses in Europe. And it documents the Irish Tach and Alish, the what they now call the Banya in the Russia and the Slavic countries, but the old name was Bozhina, which means the sacred place. It actually means the divine place. Related for the words to the words for God and goddesses. And then you have
Mm.
medieval images of Czech people in sweat houses in Central Europe with birch switches that they're kind of whisking their flesh to help the toxins come out, same as the Slavs were doing, same as the Finns still do in the sauna. And in Portugal, there are ancient, they call them pedras fermosas, beautiful stones. And there were these carved stones, especially one large block that was the entryway into the sweat house from the, the changing room where you go in, there's benches, you can sit on the benches to cool off, or you can put your clothes down. And just like the native sweat houses in North America, the entry is very low. You have to get down on your hands and knees and crawl through in order to enter this uterine chamber, which is where the heat is, and the furnace is behind that. And what's really interesting is some of these are just covered with beautiful designs. They're stone reliefs. But a couple of them have the image of a mother with her legs parted, and you crawl in between her legs or under her legs so that you are symbolically entering into the body of mother in order to go
Right.
through this sacred process of purification, healing, vision seeking, and community. And the Finnish ideas about the sweat house are very strong. No aggression, no argument, no conflict. This is sacred space. And the Russians had this too with the Bozhina. So there are things to be retrieved. A lot of things have been totally lost. One thing I think is really important for us to retrieve is the power of lamentation. There's a lot to grieve
Mm.
now. And we're
So
holding
much.
all of this in. We're stressed out. We're watching horrors being enacted. We're watching Earth being raped. And it's just like it's just emotionally devastating. And I think personally that we have to be able to bring lamentation not only into our healing circles and to learn, what is the lament? It's ritual crying. And there's a whole way that this activates the vagus nerve, which is something that connects our entire awareness from the brain through the heart to the gut where our feelings live or are trapped. It's a way through vibration and sounding and breath, incantation, lamentation, ritualized crying as a way to let that out, right? So it's very helpful in grief for a loss of a loved one, but it has a broader application as well. And I would like to see that come into our demonstrations against fascism, to bring drums and to bring the wailing
Mm.
and to do remembrance for the people in Gaza
Mm.
and people in all of these places that are being devastated, in Congo, in South Sudan, the indigenous people that are facing seizure of their lands. Not that the lamentation is the political action, but it moves people's hearts. It augments, it potentizes, and it
And we need
helps to
to
raise
lament
awareness.
together. We need to
Yes, as
lament in
groups.
public.
This is what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
Like it's not even about whether or not the politics will pay attention. It's the like what do we need to
right.
do in public together?
It's
to
creating a
reclaim
potent
the
force field
public space.
that others
Yes.
witness and are moved by, right?
Yeah.
And and also, in addition to lamentation, I think we need anthems that can be affirmations of unity and of positive principles. Not only chanting
Mm.
against, which has to happen, we do have to denounce the human rights violations, and we have to put things out that make people aware of while we're there, what we're trying to fight for. We have to have something that reaches people spiritually. And, so like in the civil rights movement, they would often sing, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it
Mhm.
shine." But there are others, of course. Bella Ciao, that originated in the anti-fascist movement in Italy, has been taken up by Ukrainians and by Palestinians, who are both undergoing,
Mm.
as we speak, invasions and genocides. So there will be more. Our musicians will come up to. There's a song called "We Will Rise." I think a Jewish group or woman and made this song. You can find it. How does it go? We will rise. I think Sarah played it in the Land Justice Futures ceremony. I mean,
I
in
think
the
I can find
webcast
it.
that
Yeah.
we did. Yeah, yeah. That one is really good, you know. And it's like, this way of, it's like, it's medicine for the spirit to be able to unify ourselves, because we have become so fragmented, especially in the wake of COVID, right? And with all of
Mm.
the social media monopolies kicking people off and deprecating posts and suppressing information, all of that's going on. I can't see it getting better than monopoly platforms, but we have to create stuff on the ground. And they're giving us the opportunity, because we have to prevent these fascist ice squads from dragging people off the streets and out of the schools and even the courts, you know.
And we have to sing together.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's it's
Yes.
it's not one person
Well,
performing. It's not about performance at all.
it's
It's an
not
older
about the
form of
singular
music,
performance, right?
right?
It's about the
It's collective,
participatory collective.
and it's
Yes.
joining spirit together in that way. I mean, you can do that most powerfully with music. You can do it with dance. You can do it per session. You can do it with art. There can be banners, you know.
Mhm.
And we're going to have to learn also to do politics differently. But
Yes.
I think that's a key, is reaching people's hearts. And obviously standing up and making a stand, you know, breaching the fear that people fear and people feel are meant to feel. I mean, you've got these men geared up in, ultra military gear and masked. That's a terroristic quality right there, you know. But
Mm.
people have been. I'm
Yeah.
impressed to see how well communities are. They're actually succeeding in driving ICE out. Sometimes they don't get their
And there's
targets.
a lot of togetherness. There is in many places there's
Yeah,
a lot of togetherness.
yeah. Even among
Well,
strangers, that's the
this has
great
been
part.
really rich. Huh?
What? That's what I said, huh?
I was just saying this I was just saying that this has been super, super, super rich.
Thanks.
And we're coming to
Yeah.
the end
Well,
of our podcast. And I
yeah.
just want to ask, is there anything that you want to leave the readers with as they think about their own journeys of remembering and re-enchanting?
Well, I'm just kind of drawing a blank there. We've covered a lot of it, but I would just say that one resource they can look at is, I blog on the Suppressed Histories Archives page on Facebook. If you're on there, go back through the photo section. If you're looking for something out of your ancestral heritage, whatever it is, it's very global. You may find something there. We're going through a process of reconfiguring the Suppressed Histories website, where all of this will be made navigable and searchable. And so that's something that's happening. But there are many, many more resources. And so I just feel like, we need to join up. We need to affirm women. We're really in a period of backlash The racialized backlash is very strong, and so is the patriarchal backlash. And watch out for witch hunting behaviors. You know, try to reweave community.
Thank you. Yes. Try to reweave community and do it. And remember those powers of the distaff and the capacity for weaving that for many people is part of your heritage and part of what you can bring to this moment. Do not forget the power of the woven fabric and the song that sings over the fabric in the process of weaving, both literal and symbolic.
Yes, chanting over the webs.
So thank you again. Thank you so much. And I look forward to more.
Thanks a lot, Sara. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.